Hello and welcome to this special collaborative podcast episode again with Sigma Nutrition, Iron Culture, and the Sports Nutrition Association. My name is Danny Lennon. Joining me as co-host is Dr. Eric Trexler. Eric, how are you today?
I'm doing great, and I've actually demoted myself. I am the assistant host, not the co-host, but I appreciate that.
Well, it's great to have you here in whatever capacity, but even more exciting and more of an honor than that is the guest that we have talking with us today, Dr. Shawn Arent, who has done extensive work in a range of topics, some of which we're going to discuss today. And I know a number of our listeners will probably be already familiar with some of his work in some capacity. But first of all, Shawn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure to be joining you.
Maybe to kick us off, and before we get into our main topic of today, Shawn, can you give the listeners some context to your background, your work in academia, some of your main research interests, and anything else that might be useful for people to know?
Sure. So I was a college athlete, soccer. I'm very grateful for that. It's treated me very, very well. From there, went on to graduate school at Arizona State. And took a faculty position at Rutgers University in 2002. And I was there for 17 years before making the move south to the University of South Carolina, where I am professor and department chair, and I direct the USC Sports Science Lab. USC is one of the top, has one of the top PhD programs in the country by the National Academy rankings, and we have for almost 20 years now. We're at the top for about 15 of those. We're sitting in the top 2 or 3 at the moment, and one of the top sports science universities in the world as well, and number 3 in the US. So we're really proud of the work we do here. We work very closely with athletics. Much of my work I deal in applied physiology, right? So we do a lot of work with athletes. We do a lot of work with the military and the Department of Defense, and even extending in first responders. But we worked in a variety of different special populations and general population as well, looking at the sort of continuum of health and performance as it goes along with that. My main background is neuroendocrinology. So we deal a lot in biomarkers, hormonal responses, and things like that, but really within the context of translation and what that means for monitoring, what that means for modifying training and nutrition. And that's some of the stuff obviously we'll touch on today, but trying to get at that notion of, in the pursuit of optimization, hopefully we catch excellence somewhere along the way, and sort of looking at it from that standpoint. And, we're very lucky. We do quite a bit of work with sports supplements as well as other nutritional interventions, all in the context of the impacts on training and with training, and really a lot of things revolving around stress. And so it's, being able to moderate stress, being able to properly apply stress. Without stress, we die, right? So we want some degree of stress, and it's really trying to keep it in the realm of eustress instead of distress, and trying to figure out what to do with it when we start to move into that area where it's a little too much on the system, and how do we back off from that? So I guess that's probably where I'm at.
Fantastic. And I think that serves the perfect basis, and you're the perfect person to talk about some of these topics. We did want to focus in on this area around cognition, and obviously one key part of that is in this realm of cognitive performance, or how cognitive function is working in situations like sporting performance even. But I think oftentimes people can hear some of these terms and maybe we need to get a bit clearer on them. So when we're talking about things like cognitive performance, cognitive function, at least in the context that we're going to discuss in this conversation, what do you think is the best way for people to conceptualize these terms?
So I think it depends on the context in terms of where we're talking about this. So for example, if we put it in a performance context, if we're thinking about athletes or military, the ability to maintain decision-making under fatigue is a big one. Certainly when you're dealing with the military and especially like special operators with special forces, you're often dealing with sleep deprivation and the need to be able to maintain vigilance. And so it's that ability to maintain concentration and to be able to rapidly respond with the right decision when the opportunity arises. And certainly, in a sporting context, that important from the standpoint of, take for example a soccer match, and you're going into added time, and people are starting to get fatigued, and you're chasing the game, and it's that ability to make the right pass, the ability to see the player that you're picking out, and things like that. And as a defender, to not make the mistake of being in the wrong place, right? So that's that in a military context, it's much more life or death in terms of being able to make that right decision and sort of a go, no go, as well as being able to choose between multiple options very, very rapidly. So I think we look at it from that standpoint. And then certainly within the more general health realm, as you start to think about overall cognitive capabilities, you know, as we look at downturning cognition with aging potentially and ways to offset that, as we look at the effects of stress on decision-making and other higher order cognitive function, when we look at, for example, executive function and sort of the higher order processing to rationalize through different scenarios and things like that. So, you know, in some cases, you may be talking about something as simple as reaction time, the ability to respond to a stimulus. And in other situations, being able to maintain that performance under multiple inputs, right? When you got a whole bunch of information flying at you and you're trying to decipher which direction you go with that. You know, I think in some ways that the exercise and cognition area has been a bit interesting because there's been some really good work in the role that exercise plays on acute cognition as well. The problem with that to some degree is that an effective exercise is just an arousal effect, right? So if you're stimulating the system and you make a decision, and I guess, you know, from my perspective, I'm not sure what the utility is in something that maybe lasts for 30 minutes, right? So you're like, oh, you perform better on some type of cognitive decision-making task. And it's like, well, unless you're about to go take a test, does it have much relevance, you know, or you're going to exercise that you're going to study for 30 minutes and maybe you'll retain it better? I don't know. So I think in that context, I think the longer term stuff with exercise is even more intriguing when we look at the effects on Alzheimer's, when we look at the effects on being able to maintain more fluid intelligence, sort of that decision-making capability rather than more crystallized intelligence, which is more memory-based. So I think there's a real relevance there. But then when you start looking at nutritional interventions where the cognitive effects are layered on top of exercise, so for example, in an athlete, in an operator, and things like that, being able to sort of raise that level becomes a little bit more important. And so I do think that some of the acute effects do matter. And that's without even getting into the brain health side of things, right? As we start to look at beyond just cognitive function, but when we start looking at things like TBI, you know, when we're looking at other brain injuries and things like that, being able to withstand high stress levels, you know, if you're talking about like high altitude aviation and sort of oxygen deprivation issues and things like that. So I think there's bigger issues there that all become part of this entire story.
Yeah, I think you've done a really good job of outlining that there's almost these different buckets and categories that we can think of distinctly that are their own thing, and we can separate them each out further. So first of all, if we're thinking about this distinction between acute and chronic effects, in these chronic effects, we can then look at, okay, over the long term, how might a diet or set of nutrients impact someone's cognitive capabilities? But then we have a kind of slightly different thing from, well, what type of diet might mitigate or offset cognitive decline later in life? Right. And that's one particular context I outlined. Then we have some of these acute effects of in situations where someone is, let's say, a quote-unquote normal functioning athlete, how could we achieve maybe better performance through the acute ingestion of a nutrient, a compound, a supplement? And so these things maybe have to be looked at slightly differently, although there is quite a connection. Maybe a useful way to start working our way through this is on that side of some of these acute effects on cognition. There's obviously a whole range of compounds, nutrients, and supplements that have been mentioned, as well as dietary strategies with varying degrees of evidence behind each.
Right.
So maybe to start, what do you think has the best evidence base, or I should say most robust in terms of the most amount of literature over a period of time, the things that we're most clear on some of these effects as it pertains to these acute effects on cognition?
It's a good question. I would actually probably say carbohydrate. You know, if you had to look at one substance that we've got a lot of work at, and really the original work on what it does to delay fatigue in sort of a high stress environment, in exercise, in sport and things like that. And the ability, I mean, carbohydrate and glucose in particular is the primary fuel source for your brain, right? So if your glucose depletion occurs through you know, a low carbohydrate diet, through glycogen depletion, through exercise and things like that, you're potentially jeopardizing the ability to make good decisions in terms of what your brain relies on. And so I would probably say, carbohydrate becomes important. And I think what gets interesting though is some of the effects in this area have been a bit mixed, but there's probably one really good reason why. It depends on what your starting level is too, right? So in other words, if somebody is glycogen full going into an event and it's not fully glycogen depleting, the magnitude of effect that acute supplementation would have or acute ingestion would have is going to be much smaller than somebody that may come in a bit depleted or with a longer duration or a much higher intensity type of effect. I mean, it's funny if we look at like resistance training. Now, hell, even if we do like repeated wind gates, you're only talking 30, maybe 40% glycogen depletion in most of these cases versus a soccer match where actually going back to some of the classic work by Bengt Saltine, you see anywhere between 90 and 97% glycogen depletion in a 90-minute match. The effects of carbohydrate supplementation at halftime are going to be much more relevant for them than it will be for somebody that's just pounding out an hour in the gym. And you may not see these big effects. So I would say carbohydrate in that respect, I think there's some really good stuff. And I think too that, there's some work that's been done looking at carbohydrate and electrolyte and even carbohydrate and protein together and the overall effects on sustained attention, vigilance, and this is in high-level athletes. And so I think that the dietary intake before, and it's funny because I think that one of the challenges in this area, and I would say probably in human performance in general, is that people are looking for the quick fix, right? So they want this magic supplement that's going to fix everything. And the reality is the overall diet is still the driver, right? That's the big needle mover. And so you can ingest all kinds of other things, but, carbohydrate and even protein to a great degree, and the amino acid side of this, which we'll get to, those are still well-founded. Those still drive the bus to a great degree. Not that other things don't work. Don't get me wrong, because I would probably say right behind carbohydrate is probably caffeine in terms of what we have evidence for in terms of cognitive effects. And those effects tend to be very strong, in terms of decision-making. And there's a dose-response effect with that as well. And that's a lot of the work that we've done. But I think overall, from that standpoint, being able to maintain plasma glucose has been shown to delay fatigue. So, one of the things is I'm not sure it's not, especially with carbohydrate, I don't think it's just an issue of the carbs fueling the brain part, but if they also delay fatigue, you're able to make better decisions as well because you're not in that state of deprivation, where it's now you're in the hole and you're exhausted because, it's one of those fatigue makes cowards of us all, and it's one of those where it'll do the same thing to your brain from the standpoint of decision making. So I think that being able to delay fatigue and be fit for an athlete is a part of this, and then the diet fuels it. Eric, what were you going to say?
Oh, that's my little signal. It says, I actually have a thought. So we're not going to see it much, but it'll pop up from time to time. I had two questions for you about carbohydrate. So, so far you've mentioned, obviously, carbohydrate, very important fuel source during exercise. Ample research looking at carbohydrate ingestion on various parameters of fatigue. I'm curious what your thoughts are about glucose and carbohydrate mouth rinsing and whether or not that has an impact on cognition, because that's a unique application of research where we can no longer say, oh, it's purely a fuel thing. Right. There has to be something else going on.
Yeah. And from a receptor standpoint, there is evidence for that. I would say that there's less of it than we get with the carbohydrate in total. And I think, too, it's going to somewhat depend on the task because at the end of the day, fuel will matter, but certainly that rinsing aspect seems to, I don't want to say it fools the brain into thinking this, but it kind of does, right? Where it's like, it's not the fuel itself, but it's the receptor sensation and the signaling that goes on with that. I find that area really interesting and not altogether convincing at times because I think, and honestly, one of the main reasons is I think we're really still pretty fuzzy on the mechanism behind it. And a lot of things have been put forward and I don't know that they've all been tested well. And it seems like it works in certain situations and not others. And that's fine. And I think it's an area worth exploring. And you're right, because then it would go beyond just a pure fuel issue. And it goes more into other stimuli that it might be creating from a receptor standpoint, the signals to the brain, in terms of reducing fatigue. I just don't think there's as much of it. And like I said, until we can really identify the mechanism, It's hard to know when and where to apply it if that's the case, because if we don't fully understand the pathway, in some ways it's a shot in the dark and kind of hoping it works, but we understand how glucose works on the brain. But the mouth rinsing aspect, and again, I find it's intriguing, right? I mean, it really is sort of a cool finding. But at the same time, I tend to deal with a lot of athletes that are pretty systematically underfueled. It's hard to get them to eat enough in a lot of cases. So telling them they don't actually need to take in the carbohydrate, they can just rinse their mouth and spit it out, kind of runs against what we're trying to produce long-term in terms of making sure they're not massively in this energy hole. So I'd rather that they eat it or drink it. But that being said, there may be a time and a place for the mouth rinse side of it too.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I could only imagine a sports dietitian at halftime for a soccer team saying, make sure you spit it out now. We don't want to get that extra couple teaspoons of sugar. It's like, dude, we're like pedal to the metal. But yeah, so I'm totally on the same page with you there. Another question I had is about glycogen or carbohydrate as a fuel. Right on the money, resistance training bouts, even when they really try to tax the glycolytic system, usually only deplete glycogen of that local muscle 30–40%. There's some intriguing work indicating that depletion isn't quite uniform, that there's different depots of glycogen. And so one of the things I caution is that sometimes people use that statistics to downplay the role of carbohydrate. And they say, well, who cares? Yeah. But I was curious, as we see that muscle force production can be impaired by depletion that's well short of 100%. Do we have any idea where we start to see cognitive performance start to decline in states of glycogen depletion? It seems like it'd almost be hard to even quantify that, but I'm curious if we have any idea.
Yeah, and partly because it depends on other systematic demands in terms of what's going on beyond just the muscle itself. And so, let's take, using your example, resistance training. It's such a controlled stimulus in terms of what we're looking at. And, it's not like,
it's purely local, It
is. And it doesn't tend to have a lot of real world relevance in terms of what you would be doing when cognition matters, right? Other than the fact that you're trying to figure out how many 45s add up to what you're trying to load and do the math on the bar. Right?
Was that number 11 or number 12?
Yeah. And so you're like, can I count reps still? In which case, even if you can't, maybe you still get a good stimulus out of it. So it's not as dire of a consequence. But that being said, I totally agree with you. And I think that we're probably also hitting on a perfect example of an activity where what you start with matters, right? Where it's, do you need to supplement with carbohydrate during the lifting bout itself? Based on what we know and with the intensity of it, I would say probably not, because most of what you're going to rely on is endogenous stores anyway. But I do think it speaks to the value of starting with high glycogen content because no matter what, you're right, whether it's 20%, 30%, 40%, there's still depletion, right? So there's still, and what I would say, if nothing else too, is it does speak to, and especially if you look at it in the context of resistance training as part of training for an athlete, right? So their time in the weight room and then they got to hit the field and stuff like that. Even that 30 or 40% depletion still speaks to they need to replenish once they're done in order to provide what you need for the next bout, right? And I think that often gets lost. And I think, unfortunately, in the nutrient timing area, which people have turned into mostly protein timing, you don't need to eat right away. No, but actually we're seeing more and more, there's evidence coming out that if you ingest carbohydrate right after your training session, there's actually downstream positive effects, and it actually helps the next training bout, right? So again, it's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it's like, well, you don't need to do this. And honestly, in those situations, I kind of look at it like, man, I hope we play your team, right? If you're doing the least amount possible, we've got really good chances against you, because I think that's where the science and the practice need to shake hands, is the reality that there's certain things in a sporting context you're never going to control in the lab or recreate in the lab. And so we look for this magnitude of effect. But in a lot of these aspects, I mean, think about it in the Olympics with some of the races that are won and lost by half of percentage points, not even percentage points, right? And so that little bit matters. Whereas I would say in the general world, if you were to tell me that somebody gets a 1.5% improvement in cognitive performance by doing X, Y, or Z, you're probably going, is that, I mean, are we even going to notice that? But honestly, for an athlete, you might, and so I think the application really, and the magnitude of the application and the time investment of applying it is going to vary depending on that setting too. And I would say that certainly in like a military setting, when there's bullets flying and, the goal is to get them home alive and to make mission, those little 1.5% improvements can actually be pretty damn important, and so, so how you apply it. But I agree with you. I think that I do think that even that magnitude of depletion is something we should have dismissed. It's not small. It's just that it's not as maybe important as what we see in an event where you're getting like 90% depletion and you go, somewhere along this, we need to replenish in order to mitigate that. And that's, I think, where the real work comes in.
Yeah, I don't know if it was audible. I was chuckling as you were talking. I love the way that you framed that of like, when we're dealing with sport, for example, maybe you deplete 35% in the weight room, but then we have a 90-minute practice, right?
Right.
And I remember when you were president of the ISSN, I was at a conference and you were up on your soapbox saying, sports nutrition is more than bodybuilding nutrition, folks. And I believe I was there at that conference to present some bodybuilding data. And I was sitting in the crowd looking around like, a bunch of idiots. Who are all these bodybuilding people? But no, it's a good point, and it gets lost a lot in the fitness world.
Yeah, and I think it's important to distinguish between sport nutrition and physique nutrition.
That's the way you put it.
And that's not to denigrate physique nutrition, right? People want to look good, they want to lose body fat, but that's not how we're fueling athletes, And so, and again, and I know it's a point of contention, and I will say, in all fairness, so my wife was an IFBB pro, so she of all people can say this, but she'd be the first one to tell you that bodybuilders are not athletes, right? Because there's no other sport where you're at your worst on the day of competition in terms of how you feel. Like, that's not performance-based. Powerlifting, different story. Olympic weightlifting, different story. That's a sport, right? And that's fine, though. It doesn't mean that bodybuilders don't need fuel in a certain way, but, clearly they're also going to deplete on purpose in order to get as lean as possible and to look as good as possible versus perform as good as possible. And so, and I'll be honest, it makes it hard sometimes existing in the performance world with athletes and even military, because that information trickles in and you spend a lot of your time trying to help them understand the difference between optimizing performance versus optimizing how you look. And at the end of the day, if you eat like an athlete and you train like an athlete, you're going to look like an athlete, right? And so, and those comes in all shapes and sizes. And I think we really saw that at this last Olympics. I think this was one of the most engaging recent Olympics where you could see the different packages that excellence comes in depending on the sport, right? And I think it was freaking cool because I think it really highlighted some things, and it's been a useful lesson for us with our athletes to help them understand where we're trying to get the most out of them, and certainly from the cognitive side, how you eat to look your best may not be how you need to eat to think your best. And I know, Eric, you've competed, I competed, it's one of those things where, and honestly, as a former wrestler as well, when you're depleted, your thinking is not particularly clear. You are struggling to put some thoughts together. That is not the environment we want for a competitive athlete, where they actually have to make decisions. It really, again, the situation, the context should drive how we do this. And I think that's honestly why I think this is something that both of you guys are excellent at doing with the way you deliver your podcasts and the talks that I've seen both of you give. I think both of you really excel at providing context to what you're talking about. And I think that's critical, because otherwise I think the message becomes too sweeping and too general, and people lose where and when this should be applied and for who. And that becomes a really important consideration when we're existing in this world of, performance nutrition, physique nutrition, things like that.
Excellent point. Just as your example of wrestling comes to mind, any weight class based sport like that, you
Absolutely.
have this real, one of the main problems, especially in that, say, final week of competition when athletes are cutting weight, is you're essentially trying to do two things that are the opposite, right?
Yes.
Everything that you were doing with them to make weight is like lowering in calories typically. They're eating less carbohydrate than you'd like. They end up restricting their water intake.
Yeah.
So it's like literally everything that you would do. If I said to you, okay, you're going to wrestle this Saturday, there's no weight classes. How are you going to prepare to be your best? You're going to eat as much as you can, lots of fluid, and it's just the opposite. So yeah, I think that's a great example.
Well, and Danny, I think to piggyback on that real quick, when you look at stuff like MMA, right, and things like that, when you cut, I mean, thank God they have time from weigh-in to fight. Same thing with boxing. But the reality is, this is maybe where some of these acute effects we're talking about really do matter, because chronically we've kind of screwed them for that period of time, right? So now we got to go, what will quickly get them back on track? Because there's a perfect example of a sport where clear thinking and rapid decision-making makes a huge difference in terms of outcomes, right? To be able to see something coming, reaction time is a huge consideration there. And so anything we've done to put them in a hole, we now have to do to get them back out of it as much as possible. And I think that strategy to replenish glycogen as fast as possible, to rehydrate, and probably to work with whatever supplements are at our disposal that have been shown to have a positive effect on this, I think are pretty key, right? I mean, there's a perfect example of a sport and activity that matters.
Well, it speaks to one of the key points that is useful for us to emphasize again for people listening that you've already made around. One of those key considerations is someone's baseline status, right? So when we're talking about carbohydrate in this context, particularly, what is their current levels of glycogen? What is our carbohydrate availability going in? Second, what is the nature of this particular demand and what type of sport or training session they're going to be doing? And the magnitude of importance or the magnitude of effect, let's say, of some of this carbohydrate provision, either before or during that training bout or competition, is going to be contingent on those things. So I think that is one of the key things that you've noted. And we can see that it's the two things that you outlined, that it's the overall carbohydrate availability in terms of that glycogen store, but also there could be some effects of signaling perspective, i.e. you don't want to enter into a competition with 40% of your glycogen full, simply saying, oh, well, I'm not going to use more than 30 or 40% because I'm only doing
good.
Probably not a good idea. Even though technically your store of carbohydrate is there, that's probably not going to lead to best performance, at least from a cognitive perspective, as well as a physical perspective. Yeah,
and I think, and ultimately we know that can impact the rate of utilization as well, because as you get lower, so for example, it's interesting, and I think where you can look at some really cool data on this is, so a single Wingate appears to deplete glycogen by as much as 20%, right? It can, right? So there's a couple of studies where it's showing it. So then by logic, you're going, okay, so if I do 3 Wingates in a row, I should be at like 60% depletion, right? Nope. It's more like 35% or maybe less, because what happens is you get this steep drop and then it starts to plateau, right? And you're going to find ways to preserve some of that in terms of enzymatic function, in terms of turnover. So it is not a linear response. And so when people are like, hey, I'm good at like 50%, starting with 50%, I only need like 30% more, that may be a very ineffective ability to use that, because your body's not going to go, no problem, we'll go down to 20% easy, right? It's like, no, it's going to slow the rate of utilization as well, because of the other part of the system that tries to protect that, as well as what it does to fuel turnover. So I think we have to recognize that as well, as it's not just a purely linear response. It is much more curvilinear.
And Shawn, it's worth noting that that nonlinear effect is not like, oh, great, we're getting more efficient. No, your performance is dropping.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. It's,
yes.
You're not like finding a magic way to create more with less. You're just creating less with less.
No, it's like, oh, I primed it. Now look, I can hold this indefinitely and I'm not going to deplete. No, it means that your system sucks now and it's not able to do the level of work you want it to do. So that is the reality, and all the reason why we don't want to get into a fully depleted state. And that's where the carbohydrate supplementation, again, honestly, we can use American football as an example. We can use soccer, any of these sports, field hockey, things like that. Is anytime you have breaks in the action, the ability to replenish to some degree, you don't want to get, just because the sport can deplete you 90 to 95%, doesn't mean that's what you want to do, right? That's our lesson for us, is we're like, hey, warning flag, if you don't do anything, this is what's going to happen. So refuel when we can, so we don't get 90% depleted, because then it makes the recovery that much harder from it as well.
From this cognitive performance aspect, I suspect some people, even outside of the sports nutrition field, will have heard something to do with glucose or carbohydrate, or even some of the research looking at cognitive test performance when someone has a breakfast beforehand versus not. But one of the things you mentioned earlier, Shawn, was that not only carbohydrate can play a role, is protein. And this is one that I think less people have heard about or less clued into. Could you maybe speak to some of those findings and why exactly we suspect this is happening?
Absolutely. So it's interesting where some of the cool work's actually been done is with branched chain amino acids. Now it's funny, BCAAs have kind of gotten a bad rap in the hypertrophy world. Like they don't really have much of an effect. But interestingly, from a performance standpoint, there have been some pretty good studies on BCAAs. Now that being said, EAAs, your essential amino acids, also contain the BCAAs, and there's been some studies showing that EAAs work the same, relatively the same way. So your safe bet could be, if you're buying into the BCAAs, you're bad, don't waste your money, fine. Then use EAAs. They're still going to work, right? Essential amino acids will still work for this. But there's some really cool work on delaying fatigue with BCAAs, as well as, because think about it, amino acids play a role in synthesis of neurotransmitters. Those are going to influence mood, focus, cognitive function, and things like that. And there's some really cool work that's been done that shows that BCAAs, I think it was back in 2000 by Davis et al. And they actually showed that BCAAs can affect central fatigue by impacting serotonin synthesis, right? So that the mechanism that we can't figure out with the mouth print stuff, we do have a mechanism here in terms of what we see, but BCAAs have actually been shown to improve attention, even compared to just carbohydrate alone. So it looks like BCAAs plus carbohydrate, or at least amino acids plus carbohydrate, could be essentials. I'm going to use BCAAs as an example because that is specifically what was used in that particular study. They have an effect, but also in professional soccer players, there was a study that was done 2010, 2011, where they showed that it positively influenced choice reaction time, right? So the ability to make the right decision quickly in that type of environment and stuff like that. So I think that, there's cool work, I think, that's been done there on the protein side of things that can't be ignored. That again, as a macronutrient, plays a role in this, and really combining it with carbohydrate is probably your best bet. And it doesn't have to be a whole protein source per se. It's not like you need to be chugging whey protein or anything. I know for a lot of people in tasks, it's not a very appetizing thing to do. It can be difficult, but the more aqueous form of essential amino acids or BCAAs makes it a little bit more tolerable. So again, there's a potential role there as well.
Could you maybe just speak a bit to that timing or acute effect here and how much that matters? That is, as with the carbohydrate, you mentioned it's important to take into account the baseline intake of someone's carbohydrate. Here, presumably, we have a similar thing perhaps with someone's total protein intake in a day being one particular aspect. But let's say we have someone who is consuming, let's say, a quote-unquote high protein diet overall. Yeah. Do we still have that potential to see some benefits during that competition or training session with exogenous provision of a protein supplement, let's say?
It does appear so, right? So if we approach this purely from a hypertrophy standpoint, we pretty much know it's the daily intake that matters to this. But that's not what we're talking about in this case. We're talking about the cognitive effects. And so in this case, it appears that there really is an acute stimulus that occurs, an acute effect that occurs with this ingestion that's related to the task at hand. And sort of the ability to do that, because again, unlike carbohydrate, we don't really store amino acids, right? Yes, we have muscle and things like that, but you have to deaminate, you have to transaminate in order to reuse it as other things. We don't have the equivalent of glycogen to pull from in order to do that. So the acute ingestion of the amino acids does appear to still have an effect. Now, that being said, to be fair, not all of these studies have, I would say, done a good job or any job in some cases of assessing total daily intake. So there's a caveat to that in terms of what it appears is happening. So we couldn't say it with certainty. But again, the protein you had 3-4 hours ago, it's funny because when we talk about sort of nutrient timing issues, I think that too often we think just purely about the acute effects of some of these things. And I think for carbohydrate, the acute ingestion post-exercise and stuff has a real relevance. Protein maybe a little bit less so, that it's certainly not going to hurt. But it's the total intake in that case. But when we start looking at cognitive effects in a specific setting, acute ingestion actually does start to matter. And so I think that's an area that deserves more exploration given the positive effects that have been seen. And much like, I mean, I look at it this way. Even if you start off with at least reasonably full glycogen, continued ingestion of glucose or some form of carbohydrate will delay glycogen depletion, right? So now when you really need endogenous stores later, when you got that finishing kick in a marathon, whatever's going on, it's available, right, for the performance standpoint. Cognitively, we could look at it the same way, in which case even the acute ingestion of amino acids can help spare some of the other resources you might have had to tap into in order to mobilize those things. And I think where I find it a bit more convincing that the acute effect is real is that it seems to be much more pronounced when combined with carbohydrate. So in other words, and it's better than either one by itself. So in other words, there's this synergistic effect that would suggest there really is an acute response here. And so I think that's worth considering. Again, studies to be done on this, absolutely. But I do find it encouraging, and it's something that I wouldn't hesitate to recommend because it's not like it's going to negatively impact you. And some of the acute ingestion, especially of BCAAs, has been shown to delay perceptions of fatigue, if nothing else. That's not a bad thing either.
To move to one of the others that you said does have a lot of evidence, and I know this is also an area that Eric has looked at considerably in the past as well, as around caffeine, which may be not of a great surprise to people listening that there's going to be some effect in the brain. But can you maybe give us an idea of just the types of outcomes that we see, positive impacts of acute caffeine ingestion, and what are some of the magnitudes of effect that we might see or might expect in those sporting contexts, but particularly relating to this cognitive outcome?
Yeah, so I would say, and you know, Eric knows this as well, but because of the work that he's done, but I would say in our lab, caffeine and caffeine derivatives have been the big focus for us in a lot of what we've done in the supplement area. We've done other stuff too, certainly, but I would say this is the one where honestly I've enjoyed these studies too. I've actually thought they were pretty cool to do. And one of the first ones we did was a pretty big dose response study in college fencers to look at accuracy and speed accuracy trade-offs and things like that. That was kind of a cool study to do. And it was interesting because at the highest dosing, we actually saw a downturn in performance because it was just too much, right? It was they didn't feel well. It was their accuracy declined and things like that. So there's relevance in there, which brings me back to your question about what are the effects of this in the sporting context. And one of the big ones actually is accuracy as well as reaction time. You know, and sort of one of the hallmarks in a majority of the caffeine research in cognitive performance has been reaction time. But the other one too, that is a very important one, is sustained attention and vigilance. And we're seeing more and more of that. And I would say that's one of the areas, especially in the early military research, that is now translated to sport. The vigilance aspect, the sustained attention has been key. And I know Jamie Tarter and some others have also done this in like e-gamers. And looking at the ability to sustain that focus for extended periods of time. And it also appears that it improves decision-making, you know, unlike alcohol, go the other way, right? You know, but the decision-making side with caffeine allows you to make the right decision faster in a multi-stimulus model. And what it appears is that these effects are even more pronounced under sleep deprivation or fatiguing conditions. So just normal resting values, it's not that we don't see any effect. It's just with sleep deprivation, especially the effects on vigilance appear to be even bigger. In general, we see there was some really cool work that was done decades ago in Navy SEALs during Hell Week and looking at caffeine's effects, and certainly talking about physical fatigue and sleep deprivation. And they noticed some pretty profound effects in that case. So, you know, that's key. And what's interesting is, so normally here's where we start getting into some cool stuff, because like, you know, the one thing we can say about carbohydrate is that it improves physical function and cognitive function, right? And maybe the cognitive functions through physical function improvement through fatigue and things like that. Now we start to get into things like caffeine, creatine, theanine, things like that, where they have a physical effect, like in terms of physical performance, but also cognitive performance. And that's kind of a cool synergy because it's not like you have to choose. You know, like, well, if I do this, it costs me this. No, it's like, it's best of both worlds. Now, the interesting thing is, from a physical performance standpoint, it looks like dosing of about 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram is sort of the sweet spot for most of these sports. Cognitive effects actually start showing up a little earlier than that. There's some studies where we've seen cognitive effects even at 2 milligrams per kilogram. So it looks like you may need even a little lower dose depending on tolerability, depending on what you're trying to get out of it, depending on the circumstances. But that would be an area where, caffeine does appear to exert its positive effects. We've seen positive effects under fatigue with soccer players. We actually designed a simulated soccer match for the treadmill that we published. And we were looking at caffeine and then caffeine plus theanine. In terms of doing that, we had just completed a couple years ago, we did a study on tactical performance, looking at caffeine and caffeine plus theanine plus dynamine, and looking at sustained vigilance. So we had to do a mind-numbing reaction time cast for a half hour before they then had to move into decision-making with, we have a targeting system that we can use for our military work, where we actually do shooting simulations and stuff like that. So we can look at accuracy, we can look at time on target, time to target, and things like that. So we've been able to look at those things in addition. And like I said, the vigilance aspect is something where we've really noticed one of the biggest differences.
I just wanted to ask about some of the timing aspects here, particularly in these sporting contexts, because this is quite an interesting area, because I think distinctly, if we take something like if someone's going to the gym and is going to do a squat session, we can time that caffeine however long before, 45 minutes, an hour before they're going to go squat, and they're kind of generally going to be fine. If we're looking at something like a soccer match, for example, and we want to have, this 90-minute bout plus halftime, and we want to make sure that someone has their best cognitive capabilities that we can during out that time. There's a case then for having some pregame, but also then maybe add halftime or other moments. But then we have this consideration of the delivery mechanism, because if we're going to take something at halftime, we don't want it kicking in after the game is over. Can you talk about some of the work that has looked at split dosing or different delivery mechanisms that might be important for different athletes?
So let's do the delivery mechanism first, because actually the one that appears to decrease time to peak is chewing gum, right? So there's some caffeine chewing gum studies where they've actually shown a pretty quick absorption. It's more like 30 minutes instead of 60 minutes where you get time on peak. This, though, is also the impetus for what we've been doing, the work that we have with T-cream, because that has a longer acting effect, but it also appears to prolong the effects of caffeine. So now you could theoretically dose 30 to 60 minutes before a match and have it last for the whole thing. And that's actually what we did. And in the first study we did with this, that was actually the design. And so we're looking at, because we're looking also at cognitive responses at the end of the match, but then we also did a time to exhaustion run, simulating added time in terms of what we would see. And there were improvements with that. So I think that's a positive thing. In terms of the split dose, you're right. You run a fine line between timing that and making sure that it's going to work. It's a little easier when I'm working with somebody in a triathlon, and we will do multiple doses then, absolutely, during it's usually during the cycling phase, probably about halfway to 2/3 into it to get us through the run, as much as anything else. But and we may even do another dose beyond that. But certainly within a soccer match or even like a football game, the peak is at about 60 minutes, but it's not like it's gone right after that. So technically speaking, caffeine ingestion, probably about 30 to 45 minutes before a match, it should stay at its peak for a 90-minute match. It's not like it declines like 20 minutes later. And what we've even done is we've used methylliberine or dynamine, which is an even faster acting compound, and layered it. So it's like dynamine plus caffeine plus theanine. So you're getting 3 different time courses in terms of when you do this. And so the dynamine or methylliberine kicks in sooner, then the caffeine stacks on top of that, and then the theanine prolongs the effect. And so this is why we're looking at it. And what was kind of cool is in the studies we've done, combining those things, and especially the theanine or T-cream, we've actually been able to reduce the dose of caffeine. So if you have somebody that's pretty caffeine sensitive, or if you're worried about, especially if I get an athlete that's like really nervous before a match, like piling on the caffeine might not be the smartest thing you can do. Now we got to titrate this a little bit, but being able to combine it with other resources to improve its effectiveness. And the other cool thing is, and this is where it had real relevance for the military and first responders, is there's real concern over the hemodynamic effects when we look at blood pressure and things like that. We did not see the same diastolic effects with theanine as we do with caffeine. And as a matter of fact, when we combined them, we still had a blunted diastolic response compared to the higher dose caffeine, but we had similar performance outcomes. And so, when you're worried about maybe the hypertensive effects, especially in populations that have these high stress jobs and hypertension is a real concern. That in and of itself is a potentially important finding to mitigate some of the hemodynamic responses.
I have a kind of a follow-up question in the realm of timing. You know, one of the things that comes up a lot, you know, I know, Shawn, you guys are in the SEC. Everything's great over there. Everyone else in college sport is in chaos, right?
Right.
So when I have, you know, a team from Duke going 3 hours west to play Cal in a night game, you know, biologically, if I got the direction right, we're talking about, it's like 11 p.m. for me, you know, my biological time. So how do you kind of balance the short-term benefits of performance with the potential for sleep disruption? Especially, you know, I know one of the benefits of theacrine is it has, you know, slower time to peak, but also a much longer half-life. I've heard kind of, I've heard dueling perspectives about theacrine's effects on sleep, but caffeine's effects are pretty well established.
I agree.
So yeah, how do you balance that when you're working with athletes who, you know, they need to perform well tonight, but maybe it's not the championship. They still need to be functional and can't be shifting their kind of circadian clock left and right on a daily basis.
So you want the honest answer to that, in my opinion, is you don't balance it. You go with what's most important at that time. So the reality is sleep may be disrupted that night of the game because it's a late game. The goal is to get it back somewhere else. And this is where the coaches have to be smart and not have these brutally early practices. It's actually funny. You talk about circadian rhythms. So talk about soapboxes. So the one thing that actually drives me nuts is these really early practices for teams when they never actually play at those times. Right? Because you talk about circadian adjustment. And I will say when we were Rutgers, I think one of the smartest things the women's soccer team did. So we had a lot of success with them. They were a phenomenal group to work with. The coaches were amazing, but they had a lot of early morning practices. And they also had a lot of injuries. They were losing games late, you know, in terms of, especially when overtime was still, you know, part of college soccer. And the simplest thing they did is, you know, one of the things we did in year 2 was we just moved practice times back to like noon, because it was like from noon to 2 or even 1 to 3, because on Sundays they would play at 1 o'clock, and on Fridays, you know, Thursdays or Fridays, they would play at like 6 or 7. So at least we were closer to that. We weren't 12 hours removed, and God, it made a difference, you know, and not only that, but it actually allowed the players to get another meal in them that morning. We knew they ate breakfast before they were reporting for, you know, training. So I would say one of the smartest thing coaches can do is, if you know, and here's the thing, Eric, I think just knowing what we know about high intensity activity as well, even without the caffeine, after a match like that, you're going to get sleep disruption, right? I mean, it's one of those things where the system trying to return to normal, it's not an easy thing after that. And so I think that in that case, then the smartest thing coaches can do is make sure that their players have the ability to catch up on that sleep or sleep bank going into it. You know, but you're right. As soon as the Atlantic Coast Conference became the All Coast Conference, it was one of those where, you know, it was, you know, I was looking at that going, oh man, you know, and same thing with the Big Ten, right? When now you're looking at, you know, Rutgers traveling to UCLA and stuff like that. You're just like, what did we do? So I think in that case, you're right. Those time zone differences are real. And I think in that case, I would argue that the role of caffeine and some of these other acute stimuli and stimulants are pretty important, right? Because this might be a way to try to get the clock where you need it at that point in time. And then you're going to have to work on getting it back somewhere later. And I think, unfortunately, the scenario that's created is very real. And I really don't know that there's a balance to it. I don't. I think it's you're picking your poison. It's which one is, you know, you're gonna worry about. And I know I always slept better after a win anyway. So to be honest, I think if you travel 3 hours and you lose, your sleep's gonna be crap anyway because you're pissed off. So you know, I think there's an advantage to doing it that way. But you're right. And we even consider this, honestly, man, even at home, right? Like when we play matches here and, you know, it's 7 p.m., we're done at 9 o'clock. I have very little expectation that sleep won't be impacted if we took caffeine at like 7 or 7:30 to get through the rest of the match. It's going to be a trade-off. And I think that's where I like the work where we're trying to look at the lowest dose possible to be efficacious in that scenario, because as long as if we don't have to go up to that 6 mg per kilogram, we have a much better chance of not having as much disruption. And that's why I like the fact that the cognitive effects can even be at a little lower dose. But you're right. I think I think some of the work that does need to be done is with theanine. And the other thing too is, I don't know, your familiarity with the athletes around you as well, and you might be able to speak to this. And Danny, with some of the people you've worked with over the years, I don't find that athletes in general always get enough sleep anyway. So to be honest, the sleep deprivation aspect or the sleep deficiency part, in this case, caffeine, theanine, things like that can actually have a pretty profound effect on them, because it seems to be where it really shines under those circumstances.
Yeah, it can be tough to convince a 19-year-old who's having the time of their life, and busy, classes, sports, everything, like, hey, why don't you get like a good, shoot for 9 a night? That's not going to happen, right?
Yeah, and I don't even do it, and I really wish I would. I would love that. I think naps are way underrated. But I agree. I think that, that's where I think leveraging these things, and kind of what we talked about before with, carbohydrate, with protein, with any of these things, when you're under those circumstances where you're making those time zone travel, where you're somewhat sleep deficient, even if not deprived, this is probably where they become that much more important in that type of context, in order to get through that. And I think it's also just recognizing where the efficacy is. And I will say with athletes, I love coffee, right? Do love coffee. It's a great delivery mechanism, but it's inconsistent in dosing. So with athletes, I definitely prefer capsules or a standardized beverage where we know exactly how much they're getting, because with coffee, it can vary so much that you don't know how many milligrams you're actually getting in them. For most other people, it probably doesn't matter that much throughout the day, with dosing. But in this situation, it does when we're measuring this milligrams per kilogram.
Shawn, you mentioned two things that I want to pull back on, because they're so important for people who do work with athletes on a practical perspective. One is that we can't expect to have it all the time, right? We're thinking about, well, how can we maximize our performance? And from all we know about supplementation, and sleep the best possible and recover the best. Well, sometimes we can't do it all. We have to pick. And then second, we can sometimes think a bit outside the box of how to solve some of these problems, instead of saying, well, the problem here is that their sleep is going to be disrupted. How can we do something with their sleep hygiene in this moment, or their caffeine, to change that? Well, maybe, as it said, the answer isn't their sleep in this moment. The answer is change their practice tomorrow morning.
Correct.
And it's actually, I spoke recently with Dr. Ian Dunnican, who is a sleep scientist, has done a lot of work with the UFC guys, for example, and spoke to this effect of, oftentimes part of the work he's saying to coaches is, hey, why don't you change from this 3 training sessions a day where the athlete's getting up and going for a run at 7 o'clock in the morning? Let's scrap that, have a longer training session in the afternoon. And now suddenly they have the opportunity to do with this other stuff. Now they're not needing to try and optimize everything from this sleep perspective and being so careful, because they can actually rest. And so sometimes thinking about it in those more global terms, the stuff that actually makes an importance to the athlete and their workload and their actual life more than anything is probably more important.
Yeah. And I think what I found is, when you're dealing in those scenarios, I often find that the training schedule is a result of one of two things. Either the coach seems to think that's what's going to build mental toughness and resilience, and somehow it makes them more hardy by having to do these sucky things early in the morning, or it's convenient for the coach because it opens up the rest of their day for all the other things they need to do. So we're just going to do morning practice. And, in college settings, sometimes it's a class issue, right? In terms of trying to structure training around when the student athletes have classes. And I understand that, I do. But I think sometimes it's a convenience factor, but not a convenience for the right people. It's not a convenience for the athletes. It's a convenience for the support staff, for the coaching staff, and things like that. Or just because they've always done it that way, right? So it's like, well, we did morning practices and it worked, and we're going to do this. And I don't know. Like I said, knowing how most of these athletes treat sleep, they're not going to bed at 9 p.m. Some of them will stay up late gaming, and now you got blue light influencing your sleep, all this other stuff. It's like, why not give them an extra hour or 2 in the morning, recoup it somewhere? And oh, by the way, you got a much better chance of them showing up to practice fueled, because if you got a 7 a.m. practice, the odds of them getting up early enough to actually eat anything of consequence to actually get them through the session is much less. And it might make sense to us, and we're mature enough at this point. We're like, well, why wouldn't you do that? Of course you do it. You're going to have some athletes that, no matter the cost, they will do it because the winning matters that much to them. But that's not true for everybody. And so I think as a coach, creating a a structure that favors the athlete's outcomes, despite what you want them to do, sometimes you got to meet them where they're at too, right? And I think I think that gets lost sometimes, unfortunately. So then we're left trying to find the acute solution of, all right, well, give them more caffeine. Here we go. We'll solve the problem.
Right.
You know, so I think that's where the reality comes in. And you're right, the practical aspect of what we may look at in a lab is not what we deal with on the field, and that's something we have to recognize.
So given that we've talked about some of those classics like carbohydrate and caffeine, what are some that are maybe have either less evidence or are less well known, or maybe some that for you are right now really intriguing that you'd like to see more work done that could potentially have a role in this area that are worth speaking to and highlighting to people?
So obviously we've mentioned theacrine, right? Or brand name is T-crine. And I do think I'm really enjoying the work we're doing with this to a great degree because we're finding some really interesting stuff. To be honest, by itself, I find it very, like there's not much to it. For whatever reason, though, combined with caffeine, that seems to be where it exerts its effects. And so most of our T-crine only groups have been fairly modest effects. It's nothing to write home about. But when combined with caffeine or dynamine, it seems to do something. So I think that's an area. And the other reason I like it is most of the evidence suggests that it's non-habituating, unlike caffeine, even though it still works through the same adenosine mechanisms. It appears to be non-habituating. So you don't need a higher and higher dose to produce some of these same effects. So I think that's a plus, right? So that would be one that I think is one that's, that I think deserves a little bit more attention. And I think, theanine has been an interesting one. There's not a lot of evidence on it, but there is some. It's an amino acid that's found mostly in green and black tea and some mushrooms. But it appears where it has a positive effect is on sleep or relaxation in particular, because it appears to increase serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. And because of that, there's a little bit of work that's been done. I'm familiar with at least 2 studies where they've shown an enhancement in concentration, improved reaction time, and reduced error rates along with better accuracy, especially when it's combined with caffeine. And so I think the combination of theanine with caffeine does appear to have some positive effects. I do think that maybe where it has potential is in sleep, because it does appear with that promotion of relaxation, there may be an effect. I've actually tried theanine with caffeine. And to be honest, I felt awful. Like it was not a good combination for me. For whatever reason, I was pretty sensitive, and then so, counterintuitively, you're like, well, if I feel like I'm about to run through a wall when I take it with caffeine, I'm not going to take it before bed. But I tried it anyway because I'm going to. And sure. And actually, I was surprised at the positive effects. And even with some of the sleep metrics I track and things like that, even looking at the positive effects on HRV was a bit surprising to me. So I think that's an area with theanine that I would like to see some more research. I'm not one of these where I'm 100% sold. I'm in, theanine works. I do think there's some cool preliminary evidence, though, that there really may be something there. What we don't really have a good handle on right now is what the dosing is, because there's not that many studies yet. So I think dosing and timing is something that still needs to be worked out. But that being said, I do think there's a promise there. I do think it is one that from a cognitive standpoint, whether it's through promotion of sleep or whether it's through its synergistic effects with caffeine for some people, I think that could be an area where we could also see this. And then I think probably last on my list, before I get to things that would be more like brain health oriented rather than just cognitive performance, would be tyrosine. So tyrosine is another amino acid. It's a precursor to dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. Now, the thing with tyrosine that's interesting is, we've talked about timing with a lot of things. Tyrosine is an easy one to mistime because it actually takes about 2 hours to reach peak concentration with tyrosine. So timing on that does seem to matter. But what it does is it looks like it increases catecholamine availability under stress. And so your ability to utilize sort of the sympathetic response can be useful, especially under sleep deprivation. It's actually been some cool work that's been done in extreme climates and military training when these things tend to happen. And there was even, near and dear to my heart, there was even a study that was done in soccer players. It was university level soccer players in a 90-minute match. And what it was is they actually simulated heat stress, right? Which has real relevance for me where I live in the summer when we're first starting the season, but it improved vigilance and reaction time, right? So, and again, not many studies on this. There's 2 or 3 that typically come to mind for me. And honestly, the 2 main ones I can think of were done back in like 2015. I don't know why it seems like tyrosine has not received a lot more attention than that, but I do think it's one. To me, I put this on my list of let's pay attention to this because there could be something here, especially under stress conditions, which is very cool. But I would like to see more in that realm. And it could easily be something that when combined with other supplements, with other food sources, could really be beneficial. But again, this is why I have it on my sort of like my next tier list, right? You got your carbs, you got your protein, you got your caffeine. I would even put tea cream up there with caffeine to some degree. And then we kind of start getting into our next level stuff where we're looking at the theanine, the tyrosine, where it's like, I think there's something here, right? There's some positive findings, but we just don't have the volume of information that we have on some other things, and especially in certain environments. And again, most of these things, especially with tyrosine and theanine. So theanine actually could be even very useful for like the general population if it does impact sleep, right? If there's a relaxation effect, that could benefit anybody, right? That's good. Tyrosine seems to be much more applicable for performance or extreme factors, which on a day-to-day basis probably doesn't make sense for most people. It's not like high on the list, but in certain situations with high altitude aviation, with military operations, with high intensity sports and things like that, I do think that's an area that we could look at a little bit more that I think would be of interest.
One that almost has a cult following of sorts, or I always seem to see people have various opinions of them that range from some people say it's great, other people say it's too risky, and then there's some people say it's not risky, but I just don't think the benefits are as strong as some people claim, and that tends to relate to nicotine. What do we currently know about nicotine from a cognitive perspective? Does it actually have these effects? Are they as great as some people say? And how do we balance that with some of the potential risks that some people have?
So nicotine's an interesting one for a couple reasons, right? One of which is there do appear to be some positive cognitive benefits. And some of it may revolve around relaxation, especially for those that are nicotine non-naive, right? So if they use this regularly, there actually appears to be a calming effect for them, interestingly enough. But the other thing with nicotine is that from a sporting context standpoint, it creates a bit of a dilemma for us in that it tends to raise resting heart rate, but lower heart rate response to a stimulus. And so the ability to mobilize resources theoretically could be compromised in these sort of high intensity endeavors, especially like with what we do with training load. That will be relevant for me looking at that. Heart rate doesn't have as much room to increase, but it also appears to, and even if it did increase, it does appear to blunt recovery between those intervals. So their heart rate doesn't come down as much recovery-wise. Now during a soccer match, super important, right? And we want that heart rate graph to be up and down and up and down. We don't want to just buzz it along the top. So I think that's an area where we could see it. That being said, I know it is very popular in a lot of military and first responder settings because of how it does make them feel more focused and things like that. I think it's an area that we probably need to look at a little bit more in sport, given that it's not exactly non-existent. And it's something that we need to consider what some of the other physiological ramifications might be. But yes, I would say there is some evidence that it can have a positive cognitive effect. And whether that's because there's a calming effect, so it increases focus, or whether it's because there's a stimulatory effect in some people and it increases arousal, I honestly couldn't say with certainty right now based on the evidence that we do have. But I think it could be potentially either one of those mechanisms. But where it confounds me a little bit is the heart rate responses, because it does appear to have that physiological impact that when you're considering performance is something we do need to think about. Now with certain sports, maybe where that's a little less important. So for example, baseball, right? Because there's the training load is not so ridiculously high anyway. It's not this continuous effort. Even for pitchers, there may be an impact there, but that could be a sport where it may have real relevance for application in certain scenarios. Whereas others, I may be a little more inclined to be like, oh, that might be a bad idea. So I would like to see more in that area, because it's funny. The fact that you mentioned that this is the third time in about 4 weeks that this has come up for me, where somebody has asked me about it because of what some of the implications were. And we were actually just talking about it in class the other day that I'm teaching. So timing wise, nice job. But yeah, that's why I think there is an area there that needs further exploration. I would not hang my hat on it being like the be all end all, and it is the best thing we're not using. I think that I do think there are some considerations there.
Right. Yeah. There often tends to be this thing of just someone has heard it from somewhere else. And yeah, it reminds me actually of snus, the tobacco oral product.
Oh, right.
I think it's originally Swedish, but it has this kind of cult following in some areas of European soccer, which I'm sure that you know.
Yeah.
And I've talked with Dr. Andy Casper, who he's currently a performance nutritionist at Newcastle United.
Okay.
But has done a lot of research in Liverpool as well. And again, seeing that there's this prevalence of the use of this without real evidence on this particular oral tobacco product, knowing the risks of tobacco use in and of itself, but just because someone else has used it within sport or they know another player that had done it. And these things cascade in sports as a kind of cultural phenomenon oftentimes.
It does. And I think that, it is funny because we're doing a podcast and I'm about to criticize podcasts, but it's funny because there's a lot of them out there. Then I think we all know which ones for the most part, where there's a lot of misinformation that's had or a lot of overstatement of fact, and people listen to that, they buy into it, and then that just propagates through it. And certainly in athletes, you are 100% right. As soon as they hear somebody else is doing this, they're like, ooh, I need to do that, right? What am I missing out on? And it's so funny because these are the same people that when you try to get them to do the fundamental basics, they give you pushback or they won't consistently do them. But oh my God, somebody else is using nicotine, I need to do that. And you're like, you're not even eating enough carbohydrate today. I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, and one thing that doesn't get talked about, in my opinion, enough with nicotine, it really never gets talked about in all these podcasts that kind of hype it up. There's really good research in tobacco users indicating that being a tobacco user tends to lead to sleep impairment.
Right. And you're right. Yeah.
And there's there's this really, we talked earlier about the balance of timing caffeine and other stimulants, but there's a balance when you become habituated to nicotine and dependent upon it, and you will if you're going to be using it regularly as an athlete.
Absolutely.
And the challenge is if you take it too close to bed, it's hard to fall asleep. But if you take it too far from bed, you will reach a withdrawal point during your sleep schedule where it is hard to stay asleep. And there is no good timing where you can carve out an 8-hour window. Right. So it drives me nuts when people are like, yeah, this is great, there's no downsides. And I'm like, how are you going to sleep 8 hours? And
I know.
Do you really think the nicotine's giving you more than a good night of sleep? And I very much doubt that.
Well, and I think what it comes down to, and kind of back to your point, Danny, about, they heard somebody's using it and then they do this and it's becoming more and more popular, is it's just funny because I think everything else we've talked about so far has better evidence for positive performance effects. And yet they don't necessarily do those. They'll gravitate immediately towards the nicotine. And to Eric's point, that is certainly not without its drawbacks. So we've already talked about the drawback with sleep, with caffeine. But again, that would be very specific to that game night. It doesn't mean you have caffeine that late on every other day, right? And so I think that becomes a bit more manageable from that standpoint in terms of not dramatically impacting the circadian rhythm. But certainly, like you said, with what we know about the withdrawal side of nicotine and what it can do to make you then not stay asleep, that is not a good scenario, right? And because now we're beyond quantity of sleep, now we're dealing with quality of sleep. And that's a whole nother issue. So it's one of those things like, okay, great, you're not getting your 9 hours of sleep, but you're getting 6.5 or 7, but they're good hours of sleep. We can work with that. But if even that's disrupted, man, now we're double screwed. That's not good.
Yeah. But before we start to finish, maybe it's worth speaking to some of the aspects that you mentioned, Shawn, around globally around, I suppose, brain health, but also that we are starting to see from a supplement perspective, at least, that go beyond just our overall dietary pattern and that have maybe some notoriety, at least in sports nutrition contexts, but now could have a role here, most notably creatine. Can you maybe speak to some of this for maybe people who are aware of its benefits in terms of physical performance in the gym, but maybe aren't as aware of the literature we have on this from a cognitive standpoint?
I think there's some really intriguing work coming out on creatine in particular for traumatic brain injury. And both from a prophylactic standpoint in terms of preventing severity, but also from a recovery standpoint. Now, admittedly, most of the work that's been done has been animal model stuff because it's very hard to purposefully give people a concussion and then measure how they respond to this. But the initial animal work was very intriguing, looking at the recovery of cognitive capability following concussion when treated with high dose creatine. And there was actually a really cool study, I believe it was in New Zealand, in kids that were reporting to the ER with concussion, with TBI, and they did a control group, treatment as usual, but then a high dose creatine group. And those in the creatine group actually responded, linguistic recovery was faster, time spent in critical care was shorter, return to function was much faster. So, again, there's some positive effects here. Now, one of the questions that's been raised, and I think rightfully so, is how much of the creatine is getting into the brain, right? And it looks like it's not a lot. So that's been taken to suggest the supplementation probably doesn't work to protect the brain. Now, I'm going to give a caveat to that, though, and I think this is an important thing that's often not considered. We don't know how much it needs to increase in the brain to have an effect. Because think about this. The brain responds to small changes very, very well, right? Because its job is to maintain homeostasis. So even a slight rise in brain creatine could have a very significant effect in terms of its ability. Because when we think about the effect of that head trauma, that traumatic brain injury, really what's disrupted when that trauma occurs is ATP provision, where there's a disruption in the bioenergetics. And it's not so much cellular deformation. It's not a cell death issue right yet. It's the disruption of the bioenergetic pathway. Creatine provides the intermediate there, right? It provides for the recreation of ATP. So it doesn't allow for that energy deficit to occur, which then has the potential to reduce apoptosis. It has the potential to reduce some of the other cellular disruption that occurs in there. And not only that, but it turns out creatine is a pretty potent antioxidant. And so the oxidative stress side of the brain too has this upside as well. So, I think I'm getting to a point with creatine where I don't see a good reason not to use it, right? I think we need to start thinking about it in the same terms we think about multivitamins, where we know that it benefits. And it's funny because, that kid study is one I point to when people are like, well, it's not safe for kids. Like, kids shouldn't take creatine. I'm like, do they eat meat? Because there's creatine in meat. And I was like, and on top of that, actually, one of the best human studies we have was high dose creatine in kids, right? And looking at TBI stuff. So to be honest, and the safety profile was remarkable. So again, not really a problem, but kids, athletes, military, first responders, older adults. And I think older adults is one where creatine can really shine both from a muscle function standpoint, but even the cognitive effects. And really where creatine does appear to have some unique, more acute effects, acute-ish, I guess would be the right word, is in vegans, right? Because their creatine intake is so low. Some of the more convincing cognitive benefits of creatine have been shown in vegetarians and vegans with creatine supplementation. And there actually were improvements in certain cognitive parameters with that beyond the TBI stuff. So that was just more, along those lines. But it can benefit short-term memory. It can benefit spatial memory. Can reduce cortical damage, at least in the animal models we've seen. So I think that's definitely one upside with creatine. And I would say closely following on its heels from a brain health standpoint, omega-3s. Omega-3 fatty acids are highly neuroprotective. And from a health standpoint, it looks like higher EPA content is really your best bet for inflammation and things like that. From a brain standpoint, higher DHA content. And I will say, without giving too much away, but I'm really proud of the work that's been done here at the University of South Carolina over in athletics. They actually have a cocktail that they put together for omega-3s, magnesium and creatine, especially the omega-3s and creatine, for as soon as an athlete has a concussion, they start with high dose administration and then taper. And I got to give the medical staff huge props for being willing to follow the science with this. And I think the dietitians here really cutting edge. Now, in full disclosure, the director of Olympic sport nutrition is my wife. So I'm contractually obligated to acknowledge the great work that they've done. But I'm very proud of it. But I do think it's been a service to the athletes. And they've even now extended this approach to what they do following injury or surgery in terms of what they apply to. So I think that's fantastic. But I do think the omega-3s, there was a cool study, I think it was in rugby players, and they actually showed that omega-3 administration also it helped with cognition, but it also helped with muscle recovery, right? So here's a double benefit in terms of reductions in delayed onset muscle soreness, return to function, but also some cognitive benefits along the way. And I think that we're seeing it there, and it's been used with TBI, and because again, strong antioxidant, reduces that cellular death, that apoptosis that we would normally see. But again, most of that work, full disclosure, is in animal models, right? Because that's a difficult study to do ethically in humans. But I know there is some work ongoing with this, and I'm looking forward to seeing what that looks like. But again, I think the other thing too that we have to be aware of with the fish oils is I think we tend to under-consume the omega-3s for reaching a beneficial effect. In most cases, most of these studies where they've seen a benefit, it's at least 3.5 grams per day, up to 6 grams per day. Mike Lewis, who was a physician in the Army for years, great scientist as well. He's published quite a bit with Rick Kreider. They've done some really cool work in this area. And Mike has used this for a long time with treatment for TBI. And he really firmly believes that I'm in a 6 gram dose per day, especially at the initial stages of TBI. And it appears that, there are no drawbacks to combining with creatine. So again, I think that those are two areas from a long-term brain health standpoint that can be really good from that standpoint. But again, it's, I think there's some upside there that we need to look at. And again, I don't see the downside, right? It's one of those where, why not? Because there are other benefits to it as well. And if you can protect the brain and the heart at all costs, like whatever we can do, that's a really good idea. I think that's key. And I'm starting to see magnesium show up in that conversation more and more as well, because we know that magnesium concentration in the brain affects a number of different physiological processes that control cognitive function. And it appeared now, the thing with magnesium, though, is the form of magnesium matters, because different types of magnesium have different effects. And it appears magnesium threonate in particular appears to cross the blood-brain barrier most effectively, and it's been the one most implicated in like learning, recall, and memory. Magnesium bisglycinate or glycinate tends to be more implicated in stress and cardiovascular function. So you have some things to choose from here, but I think the threonate is the one that I've been most convinced by in the literature as it relates to at least the cognitive side of things. Maybe not the stress part, but certainly the cognitive part, and really where it may play a role in return to function following TBI. It looks like magnesium supplementation does have, again, mostly animal models. Again, a constant caveat, but I do think there's an application here. And generally speaking, magnesium levels are an easy thing to get tested with blood work, and it's an area that I really like. Same thing with omegas, right? You can get your omega-3/6 index and your omega index overall, and look at those values. So I think these are areas that I see real promise and very little downside to supplementation with those things, because we don't tend to get enough of them in the diet.
Well, this is a perfect example, I think, in sports nutrition practice, particularly at elite levels or in situations that really matter, like post-concussion, where there is this, not a dilemma of sorts, but this kind of fine line for people who want to be evidence-based sports nutritionists to toe, right? Of that we've always learned, particularly in general information we're going to give out about the quality of evidence we give. But if we have a situation here where there are really significant risks in this period post-concussion, and there's no real downside, and we have some degree of evidence, we need to take all of those things into account when we're then putting in a recommendation. And if there's no real risk, then the evidence-based thing to do would be, well, why wouldn't we do a high-dose omega-3 or high-dose creatine, especially if it's going to be for a number of days post that TBI, right? And I think it speaks to it where you say, like you have there in university, and I know the Performance Institute for the UFC similarly have types of protocols post TBI that mirror some of these things around high doses of these particular nutrients. And I think it's just a great example of that line for a practitioner of taking literature, and in lieu of not having the ideal amount we'd want and the robust amount we want, we can't do anything right now, but yet we still have to take decisions with athletes in a very vulnerable situation. And I think it's a perfect example.
Yeah, and I think that there's enough evidence, and even if like people can be like, oh, it's in animal models, there's a lot of things that started in the animal models that we rely on as evidence that are actually useful. The difference is often in the dosing and maybe the magnitude of response, but from a brain injury standpoint and things like that, you know, I think I find the evidence very compelling. And to your point, you know, and I remember, you know, one of the things I always love that Joey Antonio always says is, if it helps or doesn't hurt, give it a shot, right? If it hurts, don't do it. But right, if it helps or doesn't hurt, give it a shot, because it may work for you. You know, and I think that this is one of those examples where, given how big of an issue TBI is, and also, you know, where I'm interested, I think some other applications with creatine that I would like to see in the research that I think some of this is ongoing right now is also application for recovery from stroke, looking at its role potentially in Alzheimer's as well, and things like that, because of what we know it can do for overall brain health and recovery. I really think there's something there that needs to be examined more. And I know there's some cool work that's going on with Craig Sale right now over in the UK, where they're doing some really cool fMRI work with creatine dosing to look at where it's being deposited in the brain, if at all, and using tracers to do that. So I think the evidence is coming. But again, to my point, how much does it take, though? Even if we don't see large amounts getting into the brain, that's not a big organ, right? So the ability to influence its physiology, that's one thing that the brain is very good at, is detecting those small changes, right? It doesn't take big changes in certain metabolites to change blood flow, yada, yada, yada. Same thing with creatine, man. If we can fill the gap with that ATP in the meantime, while, you know, we're dealing with that trauma, there could be some real upside there.
I don't know if there's any loose ends that we need to tie off, Eric, or that you want to put to Shawn before we start wrapping up here.
No, Shawn is a legend, and he provided us with a masterclass. There are no loose ends when you got Shawn on board.
Absolutely.
Doubt that entirely. I'm pretty sure that you guys are just giving up and tapping out at this point, so I don't blame you. And the listeners are going to be like, what the hell did this guy talk about for an hour and 20 minutes? But no, honestly, I love talking to you guys. And I think these are really cool areas. I enjoy the work that we get to do with a lot of this. We have some stuff on the horizon in our lab that we're going to be looking at as well that may kind of tie into a lot of this, but certainly on the pain side of things and recovery issues and things like that. We'd even done some work in CBD, you know, that was recently published, and we didn't see a lot with it, but it was purposefully low dose because of what's allowed right now. But again, you know, I think those are areas that the work needs to still be done. People can be like, it doesn't work. And it's like, well, we don't actually know that. It's useful to do these studies. Then we go, wow, it doesn't work. That's okay too, right? I think sometimes it's funny, you know, both of you guys probably realize this, but it's like, yeah, you ever realize there's like certain labs where it seems like everything works? It's always a miracle. I swear to God, I exist in the lab where nothing works. I mean, it's just one of the, like, man, we didn't find anything. But I will say that's why when we see things like we do with caffeine, like we have with creatine, with caffeine, with some of the stuff with creatine and things like that, honestly, I'm pretty blown away from the standpoint of application, because we realize that not everything works, and that's okay. You know, and so some of these things, when they do, you're like, man, there's something here. Like this is pretty legit. And so I think there's some cool areas to go. And you know, Danny, I love your point about the evidence-based. I think that evidence-based doesn't always mean you have to wait for the perfect study to come out on that, because you might be waiting a very long time. And the reality is, in the world of human performance, the funding for these things is not always easy. I've been very lucky throughout my career to have good funding from the military, as well as industry, to be able to pull these things off. But it's not exactly like NIH is funding me to look at the effects of tyrosine on athletic performance, right? So there's aspects there. You move it to a more general population model, absolutely. But I tend to deal in the world of performance. That being said, then you can scale that down to the general population, because performance matters for them too, just in different magnitudes of effect, you know? And so I think there's take homes here for everybody. It just depends on whether it's, you know, is the juice worth the squeeze? For what the cost might be. Obviously, when you talk about things like caffeine, coffee is pretty cheap, especially if you make it yourself instead of buying it all the time, right? But it's not like we're talking about create cheap molecule, right? Like the cost to benefit is really in favor of using these things. Other things maybe not so much when the cost to what you get out of it is mismatched.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point, and it actually speaks to a broader important point about us evaluating research, and a point that at least on our podcast, we've tried to make to a number of people, this misunderstanding of the difference between that hierarchy of evidence everyone classically has seen versus the standards of proof to be able to make a decision. And so in the same way that our standard of proof is going to be different from putting someone in prison for murder versus deciding if someone made a normal everyday decision correct, there's different standards to determine fault there. The same way the standard of proof to determine a treatment or a drug for someone with a chronic disease is going to be different from saying, can this athlete that I work out in a one-to-one situation, can they take some fish oil for the couple of days after a game? The standards of proof we need to meet are going to be different. And so, we don't have this overwhelming body of multiple RCTs and meta-analyses showing high degrees of benefit, but we probably don't need to get there for some decisions. For other decisions, we do. And so understanding those ideas are crucial. But with that, Shawn, thank you so much for sharing your work, for more broadly than that, the work that you do and the contributions you make to the field. And it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you about some of that.
You guys are awesome. No, I appreciate you.
And Eric, thank you so much for your contributions as well, and for being an excellent assistant to the host today.
I do my best. And thanks a lot, Shawn. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.